Hello, welcome. The title of today's lecture is Alexander Dugin Through the CTMU Lens. And we'll be covering Alexander Dugin's work, his work in geopolitics, politics, sociology, but mainly his coverage of his key influence, which is Martin Heidegger, the great 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger, who saved Western philosophy in his own terms. And we'll be discussing how Langen relates to both Dugin and Heidegger, and how Langen completes the mission of Heidegger, and so completes the mission of Dugin only in the West. But Dugin is carrying out this mission for the Russian people, and he considers things like Dasein and geopolitics and geosophy, which we will cover below. But also, this will be delved deep into the work of Martin Heidegger, what the Heideggerian breakthrough, the Heideggerian revolution in philosophy really means for Western philosophy. The thesis is that Dugin carries through on the Heideggerian mission to save Western philosophy and leaves us on an important path, an important path. The very conception of being versus non-being, and conceptual use of language as language saves the West. According to Dugin Heidegger axis, language saves the West. Everyday language, the embeddedness and ready to hand of it and being inside of a language saves philosophy. From the fatal misstep at the beginning of Western philosophy in Plato. Plato and Parmenides, as we'll cover below, made a fatal misstep according to Heidegger and Dugin. We well know that Langen proofs and completes the thrust of Heidegger's mission with self-configuring, self-processing language, and that this proves Heidegger's thesis that language is the house of being. Heidegger famously said in his work, Letter on Humanism, that language is a house of being, I think in 1951. Point 1. Dugin's work in politics and sociology. So Dugin has been called Putin's brain. I don't know how much of that is fact or fiction, but Alexander Dugin has been called Putin's brain as an advisor to Putin on geopolitics and politics sociology. Dugin's geopolitical works include the concept of Dasein, which is their being, which is really the embodied spirit of a people. Dasein, it translates in German to their being. It really is about an embodied spirit and a people's spirit. Dasein can refer to a people's spirit. So the lived embodied spirit of, let's say, the Russian people, the American people, the Canadian people, or the English people, is a lived out embodied spirit of that people. Geosophy, which is a geographically contained philosophy. So the great poets of England and France and Germany and America contain their geopolitical philosophy in that poetry, in that language, and in metaphysics as well. I'm just doing a whirlwind tour through Dugin's work, the first part of his work, but we really want to get to the Heidegger stuff. So I'll cover this shortly. Ethnos, so Dugin being a sociologist, he's a PhD in philosophy and sociology. So sorry for the whirlwind tour here. Ethnos, according to Dugin, is a people with a shared language, shared history, and shared customs. So in Russia, the Russian people share language, history, and customs. And you could say the Americans, even though there's multiple races in America, share a same history, language, and to a certain extent customs. I know the customs part's breaking down across different populations in America now, but generally speaking, Americans can share language, history, and customs and culture. But I will say, for all of this, for the geopolitics and sociology, Dugin's geopolitical works, talking about Dasein, the spirit of a people, the embodied spirit of a people, geosophy, the philosophy of a geographic territory, and ethnos being the shared language, history, and culture of a people. Langen's idea of stratified identity in the CTMU, stratified identity, can cover all these bases, as well as telos. Stratified identity in Langen's work, and telos can cover the aspect of spirit and people's spirit and the embodied lived existence of people and their destinies, right? Covers these bases. So Langen's model can incorporate Dugin's work in this way, this first half of Dugin's work. Point 2, getting to the meat of the Heideggerian influence of Dugin, the fatal misstep of Western philosophy. Dugin wants to correct this by using Heidegger. And Dugin believes that since the Russians never went down the same rabbit hole as Western philosophy, the Russians can start with a fundamental ontology based on Heidegger and based on the Russian language. But for our purposes, Dugin identifies what Heidegger identified as a fatal misstep in Western philosophy, which was made by Plato in his book Parmenides, where he made this distinction between being and non-being. Right? Being versus non-being is a fatal, sublating being versus non-being. It's a fatal misstep of Western philosophy that Heidegger diagnosed with sublation. Sublation is taking a concept, taking something out external to yourself, sublating it, bringing it into your mental representation, and that mental representation bring it into your mental apparatus as a representation. That's what sublation is, bringing something into your mental apparatus as a representation. So sublation, so when you say being and you sublate it, you take it into your mental representation, that's making a fundamental error because you posited being versus non-being, which we'll get into here. So that's the fundamental misstep of Plato, according to Heidegger. Plato said this is being versus non-being, and he sublated the concept of being. And the problem with that is that the suprasensible properties of being, such as parousia, which is Greek for presence, the presence of being, or the esse, Latin for essence of being, the presence and essence of being. What are these properties? What are these suprasensible properties? That gets back to the fundamental issue of philosophy that eventually Langen solves, which is how do you identify the properties of something and you sublate it, and how do you know that you have access to that thing out there in reality, right? What are the properties of it? So by positing being versus non-being, you're assuming that being has all these properties, but what you did is you put on the same line, that same syndiphionesis as non-being. And so being ultimately passes over into non-being, which is a huge, critical, fatal misstep according to Heidegger and Dugin in Western philosophy, is that being, because the supersensible properties and sensible properties, trying to bring those properties into your thought, and it's a failure of your sublation and failure of doing that process of bringing the properties of being into your thought versus non-being, then being passes over into non-being because the properties are all garbled, right? The properties of being are all garbled. Parousia, esse, all the other properties you might, actuality, existence, they can't concretize being versus non-being. And so the properties pass over into, they're the same as the concept of syndiphionesis, as Langen spells out, that X and Y on the same medium of reality. Being and non-being on the same plane, and being passes over into non-being in this fatal misstep. So that's owing to sublation. Remember, bringing mental a representation of a thing into your mental apparatus. Then the supersensible properties, parousia, presence, esse, essence in Latin. Parousia in Greek is presence. There's a huge fatal misstep. And then we'll get to this, point 3, the will to power. The will to power is a will to nothingness. So Western philosophy, according to Heidegger, started with Plato, after the pre-Socratic, started with Plato, went through Aristotle, went through the Thomistic philosophies, and then ended with Nietzsche, went through the German idealists and Hegel, but ended with Nietzsche declaring a will to power as a will to nothingness, right? Because if you make that fundamental error of making being non-being, being passing over into non-being, then there's a nihilism inherent in your philosophy. And so Nietzsche just declared that nihilism and said the will to power, and then I think it was either Zizek or Heidegger said the will to power is a will to nothingness. Ultimately, it's a nihilism. The will to power is a nihilism. It's a will to nothingness. And so that's what happens when you make this fatal misstep, according to Heidegger and Dugin, of sublating and positing being and non-being on the same continuum, not even on the same continuum, but just the very idea of sublating being as a thing, as a presence or essence. That leads to the nihilism and leads to Nietzsche finally declaring at the end of Western philosophy, the will to power is a will to nothingness. And you get into Dugin, and Dugin talks about how there's a midnight in Western philosophy. We're at the midnight of Western philosophy. The West is at midnight with Nietzsche and the deaths and the catastrophe of the 20th century. The will to power, will to nothingness ended the midnight call of the Western philosophy, and we will see a new dawn. Which brings us to point 4, the resolution of this. And Heidegger leads us down a path, and in his Being and Time, he talks about all this being and non-being, this passing over, this fatal misstep of Western philosophy, and the fundamental ontology that what can correct the being versus non-being fatal misstep, which we'll get into below with language. But Heidegger says leads us down this path, and that's as much as he can muster. He finds a something of a new path of resolution towards solving the fatal misstep of Western philosophy, and he leads us there in Being and Time with the idea that you can have a fundamental ontology, and that the inceptual language of everyday language can solve the problem of fundamental ontology and the truth of being as what he calls bang, B-E-Y-N-G, bang rather than bing, which in German it's sang versus sign. Sign is being, sang is the truth of being. In English, it can be translated as being is sign, being is being, and bang is the truth of being, the fundamental ontology, which I'll get into below. Don't worry. Point 4, conceptual language, and this is the resolution to the nihilism of Western philosophy, according to Heidegger. And we're covering Heidegger because it's so critical for all of Dugin's thought. The conceptual language and everyday language are common expression. What we talk about with each other, talking about each other's being, each other's being, each other's existence, is as truth, and it's a fundamental ontology. So embedding yourself in an everyday language, the language that we use in English or German or French or Russian, it embeds the person as an existential Dasein, a there being, an embodied spirit, and a being and a truth of being, and a fundamental ontology. Right? The inceptual language is everyday. The inceptual language, everyday language, is inceptual to a fundamental ontology. So when I say to you, go close the window, go do this, I tell you, you're a hard worker, you're a good person, you believe in God, you worship God, you're a good, faithful person. This everyday common parlance has more to do with the fundamental truth of being than any philosophical sublation or representation of an idea of being versus non-being, right? So why do we have to usurp common language when we're talking about philosophy? As so Heidegger says, common language actually contains within it a very contextualized, embedded philosophy, and he calls it ready to hand rather than present at hand. Western philosophy is concerned with presence, parousia in Greek, presence, but Heidegger is concerned with readiness to hand, the actual embedded contextual existence and actuality, and concretization of being as a spirit in a lived body, right? In a fleshly body. And it's contained in an inceptual language. So, this is the fundamental ontology, and Dugin believes Russians can start, don't have to go through the same issues as Western philosophy. They can start with this fundamental ontology. I will say for Langen, as far as the CTMU is concerned, that self-configuring, self-processing language for Langen is a better form of this language that we believe that Heidegger said language is a house of being, and Langen provides this in mathematical metaphysics as a self-configuring, self-processing language that is actually the language that reality is and consists in, and he carries Heidegger's statement that language is a house of being more radically forward. And also this self-configuring, I'm just thinking of this now, the self-configuring, self-processing language carries the same inceptual markers as everyday language. So it doesn't usurp language's properties of giving meaning to fundamental ontology, to the state of being, right? When Heidegger says that everyday language is more important to being and the truth of being as a fundamental ontology, Lange doesn't usurp this with self-configuring, self-processing language. He just posits self-configuring, self-processing language as the reality of the universe, right? So Langen proofs Heidegger and completes his mission. Langen saves Western philosophy. Heidegger was concerned with saving Western philosophy. Langen saves Western philosophy through his whole theory of everything, through the CTMU, the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. So Heidegger led us down a path, and Langen took us further down the path, right? There's a forking in the river. The fatal misstep that Plato took that led to Nietzsche. Heidegger went back to the pre-Socratics where they didn't have this mistake and took us down a new path, took us a little bit of a way down the path of not having this issue of being versus non-being. And then Langen takes us further down the path and construes self-configuring, self-processing language as the reality that we inhabit. That language is a house of being. And so keep this in mind that your fundamental language when you're discussing with your family and friends, everyday language, you carry more inceptual fundamental ontology in that everyday language than all the philosophers that came before you, right? The contextual, ready at hand embeddedness of this concretization of spirit, existence, and actuality as you see it in everyday language is more philosophically sound of a fundamental ontology and the truth of being than the positing the sublation of the representation of being versus not being as Plato made in Parmenides. Your everyday language is that powerful. And Langen would call your everyday language and the reality that you have, the self-configuring, self-processing language, and the human cognitive syntax. So with this, I leave you. Langen, as you see, this is all getting back to Dugin. So Dugin believes that Heidegger can save the Russian people through this inceptual fundamental concept of inceptual fundamental ontology. He can save the Russian people. He believes in the geopolitical and sociological categories that we discussed at the beginning. But I will say that Langen interprets both Heidegger and Dugin and brings it more to full completion and goes further down the road and saves and reinstantiates the essence, the truth, I should say, not essence, but the truth of Western philosophy. With this, I leave you my piece I gave you. With this, I leave you my piece I gave you. Until next time, in the name of Jesus Christ. Hope this was good for you, and I will have an article that spells this out in written form so you can read over it several times over. Sorry if this was kind of a whirlwind tour, but we get to all these concepts. I'll recap here. So Dugin has his work in politics, sociology, geopolitical happenings with Dasein, there being, ethnos, sociology, politics, And Langen can cover this with stratified identity, and Telos can cover all these geopolitical workings with stratified identity and Telos. 2, Dugin believes that Heidegger corrects the being versus non-being dichotomy, the sublation of being, and the fatal misstep of Western philosophy, which is positing being and non-being, and the supersensible properties lead to being into passing over into non-being. And so nihilism, which leads to 3, which is Nietzsche's will to power and will to nothingness, is the end point of Western philosophy after making this fatal misstep of being versus non-being. And so Western philosophy is at midnight. And then Heidegger says, let's go back to conceptual language of the pre-Socratics. Let's go to our everyday language to find the fundamental ontology, the truth of being as bang, B-E-Y-N-G. And then I will say that Langen proofs this without self-considering, self-processing language, and goes further down the path of saving Western philosophy and completes it and completes Heidegger's mission and completes the path of Western philosophy. So with this, I'll leave you a piece I gave you. Until next time, take care. Amen. God bless. In Jesus' name. Bye-bye.